Hello, my name is John Powers, and I am Assistant Professor of Film and Media Studies at Washington University in St. Louis. Thank you for watching my virtual presentation. It's great to be presenting for the first time at SCSMI, and the name of my talk today is Cycles of Confusion, Time Lapse Looped in Hollis Frampton's Remote Control. This is a portion of some research that I've been conducting on avant-garde or experimental films that challenge and even undermine the epistemological foundations of time-lapse cinematography. Now, for this talk, I'm going to focus more narrowly on one particular film as a case study, and that is Remote Control, a film made by Frampton in 1972. More specifically, I'll claim that in this film, Frampton employs looped repetitions of time-lapse images to force viewers to reckon with the limitations of their perceptual and cognitive faculties in processing visual information. And although the two are related, I'm going to focus more today on the loops than on the time lapse. But I want to present this slice of the research here at SCSMI because it deals the most directly with Frampton's ideas about cognition and film spectatorship, and my analysis builds on arguments by scholars such as David Bordwell, James Peterson, and Paul Taberham. Remote Control occupies the sixth position in the seven-part Hapax Legomena, which is arguably considered filmmaker Hollis Frampton's greatest cinematic achievement. Critical exegesis, however, has heavily favored its first three parts: nostalgia, poetic justice, and critical mass. Consensus holds that Remote Control is a weaker entry, which perhaps explains why it does not appear on the Criterion Collection set devoted to Frampton's work. Now, I bring this up because the film is likely unfamiliar to most of you, and I will be analyzing it in some detail, so I'm going to hazard a description. The foundation for Remote Control is a hectic time-lapse sequence of programs that appeared on Frampton's TV over the course of an evening. With the focal length of his Bolex set to eliminate anything outside the box, Frampton filled a 100-foot roll, so approximately 2 minutes and 45 seconds, with images of faces, cowboy hats, cars, city streets, science labs, talk show hosts, and other transmitted ephemera, taking approximately one frame for each change of the visual field. Now, this fervid condensation was shot in color and printed to black and white stock, which lends the images a slightly sepia tone. The film's 29 minutes, depending on projection speed, consist of loops of this sequence punctuated by seemingly random insertions of black title cards displaying circled white numbers from 0 to 40 that, according to Frampton, represent abstract principles for organizing moving images. The most frequent number to appear, the number 1, is always accompanied by a graphic image of variations on a square with dotted line edges receding into one-point perspective as though being projected. Now, Frampton's unusual time-lapse methodology ensures that each frame is entirely different from every other. Hapaxes, or things that appear exactly once within a given context, that Frampton's compatriot Peter Kubelka might call strong articulations. This results in a lightning pace and abstraction of the images, whose specificities become general arrangements of kaleidoscopic visual patterns. So battered by this, what Frampton called further and further acceleration of the eye, we skim the surface of the film trying to grasp an object that outpaces us. After 10 repetitions of the loop, one of which appears in color, numbers scattered throughout, the film comes to an abrupt end. addition to being conventional rather than naturally occurring, television images are related more by attributional similarity than they are stages in an evolutionary process. As you probably saw, remote control's moments out of television time are reduced to graphic constellations of movement that congeal and disperse into visual patterns. That is, the images are accelerated to such a degree that their specificities are subsumed in the visual barrage. I want to advance the claim that by looping time-lapse sequences, Frampton activates cognitive and perceptual processes, such as pattern recognition, inference, and memory, in such a way as to thwart our abilities to assimilate visual information, putting viewers in touch with the unreliability of their own perceptions. Now, the activity of consciousness played a pivotal role in Frampton's philosophy of art. In some cases, Frampton hewed closely to metaphors circulating within 1970s avant-garde film theory, that cinema, quote, has its roots in consciousness, is, quote, responsive and responsible to consciousness, or incarnates, quote, the movement of consciousness itself. Now, I know that all of you are familiar with Paul Taberham's work, so I'll direct you to the introduction of his book, Lessons in Perception, which expertly itemizes many of the ways that experimental filmmakers drew on folk psychological tropes from the science of perception and cognition. And of course, James Peterson's Dreams of Chaos, Visions of Order is also very relevant here. For Frampton, artworks extended compulsory invitations for viewers to contribute to the experience by undertaking the mental activity required to fill, quote, the gaps in sense perception through acts of creative seeing. The openly participatory logic of his cinema, then, initiates this process. Federico Windhausen summarizes this idea nicely. He writes, "The manifestly schematic and permutational structures of Frampton's films signal to the viewer that his or her attention is being directed in a deliberate and purposive manner." Or, as Frampton himself stated aphoristically, quote, "The spectator is the protagonist of the film when the work is done." In conversations about the films in his oeuvre that included loops or permutational image sets, Frampton drew on language reminiscent of a constructivist model of psychological activity, a framework later posited as applicable to narrative filmmaking, as I know you know, by David Bordwell, to theorize a spectator who makes active judgments and inferences, forms hypotheses about the film's operations, and searches for patterns to confirm or disconfirm those hypotheses. Discussing his film Palindrome, for example, which is a complex ordering of permutations of colorful photographic abstractions into palindromic phrases, Frampton plotted the viewer's activity as a curve of perception that ascends from the initial expectation that the film's imagery will change, plateaus at the ongoing mental process of constructing the form of the work to ascertain some kind of internal organization, and then descends with the realization that the film will continue until it has exhausted its material. So Frampton had a very problem-solving oriented model of spectatorship. In avant-garde cinema of the 1970s, this model of perception, if not usually explicitly invoked, aligned with many of the strategies attributed to what was called structural film, alternately referred to as the participatory film. Loop printing and other methods of image repetition, in this case, were often assumed to produce an accumulative effect. With repeated exposure, the viewer learns to see more, to discover an inexhaustible complexity that gradually accrues with each cycle through the loop. For example, Fred Camper argues that many spectators find George Landau's looped film, film in which there appear sprocket holes, dirt particles, edge lettering, etc., too long. But for him, quote, "This film hardly runs long enough for all that is contained within it to be seen." He stresses that, quote, "If you really watch the film, you'll become aware of a great variety of experiences within it." Similarly, Ken Jacobs notes that a film contains potentially infinite varieties of things that, quote, you just don't see when it zips by at 24 frames per second, which compels him to mine his footage, excavating more than it initially allows us to perceive. He writes, what I'm after, of course, is vital, interesting, amusing, crazy-making stuff. Frampton advances a similar notion in commentary on his film Artificial Light, which consists of 20 loops of a 1.5-minute passage of his friends hanging out in a loft, each of which is subject to a variety of visual manipulations. Frampton claimed that the film expressed his perspective on, quote, the problem of knowledge and the impossibility of knowing anything in one pass, so to speak, or in any finite number of passes. Thus, if Camper and Jacobs concentrate on the process of discovery that repetition facilitates, the fruit of the viewer's cognitive labor as an unearthing of interesting stuff, Frampton emphasizes the futility that is discovery's flip side, raised to the status of an epistemological conundrum. What happens when the search for patterns becomes merely fatiguing, when hypotheses are unceasingly disconfirmed, when the satisfaction of a tricky problem solved is withheld? In his filmmaking generally, Frampton displayed a consistent interest in any system's potential for entropy. In remote control especially, Frampton marshals his time-lapse loops to explore the ways in which repetition of visual information does not lead to the confident acquisition of knowledge about the object, but proliferates uncertainties and raises doubts about what and why we are seeing. Now, a necessary aside. From the clip that I showed, it's probably clear that it's impossible to identify the programs that Frampton filmed, nor does remote control depend on being able to recognize them. With help from the trivia buffs among the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Filmies listserv and the television listings from the New York Daily News, however, I have been able to reconstruct the sources. I'm going to identify them briefly for reasons that should become evident in a moment. It's clear to me that Frampton shot the film on the evening of October 4th, 1972, starting around 8:40 p.m. and ending around 1:45 a.m. on the morning of the 5th. He filmed 11 seconds of, time-lapsed, of course, of Wild Wild West. He filmed Madigan next, an episode of Madigan for 42 seconds, an episode of Search for 44 seconds. He got commercial breaks, nightly news, The Tonight Show in there for 23 seconds. He spent a lot of time on Channel 4, as you can see. He went over to Channel 9 to get 41 seconds of the movie 4D Man, and he ended with a very short little passage of the Cape Town Affair on Channel 2. Now, whether or not Frampton went to bed immediately afterwards is a subject for further research, as they say. But what I want to suggest is that remote control does not offer the revelationist rewards of, for example, Jacobs's Tom Tom the Piper's Son, whose eternal return to the titular 1905 biograph short provides a fertile supply of regenerative experiences. By contrast, remote control is considerably less abundant. At first, an accumulative explanation of remote control's loops seems logical. Perhaps the goal is to train ourselves to pick out isolated films from the speeding gestalt. Yet directing our cognitive activity toward identifying visual patterns turns up relatively few surprises. Close-ups of faces, familiar, like Ed McMahon or Joanne Flug, and unfamiliar, most others, impress themselves most assertively. The frequent appearances of cars, hats, and a conspicuous white dress in Madigan are signposts that we come to anticipate. Two intersecting circles, honing devices indicating a character's location in Search, provide a memorable abstraction. 4D Man, in particular, boasts a great many shot-reverse shot sequences, which proves to be a syntactical convention easy to spot in fast motion. While these discoveries are fairly banal, a more remarkable phenomenon begins to assert itself over the course of the film's 29 minutes, which is that it becomes nearly impossible to determine where the loop begins and ends or how many iterations have elapsed. More intriguingly, I would argue that a viewer without the knowledge that the film is, for the most part, 10 unchanging repetitions of the same sequence can be easily convinced that the loop actually is changing, that we're dealing with a permutational set, perhaps on the order of a palindrome. More than revelation or pattern recognition, our cognitive activity is channeled toward an awareness of the epistemological uncertainty inherent to the sense-making process. This accords with one of Frampton's professed filmmaking objectives, to explore, quote, the malleability of the sense and notion of time in film, which he elaborates as investigation of the temporal plasticity proper to an art that subsists at once within the colliding modes of memory, absolute presentness, and anticipation. Of course, this seems like an obvious interpretation of a time-lapse film, but I want to examine the particular manner in which the loops and the numbering system influence the viewer's perception of the time-lapse, and then the epistemological questions that this raises. Recall that interspersed throughout remote control's loops are flashing numbers that Frampton claimed to condense, quote, 5 strategies that I myself had already used in making films, reduced as it were to numerical notation. Scott MacDonald has demonstrated that Frampton's system is internally coherent even if it can appear random. I'll summarize it quickly. Now, the particulars are not super important for the rest of my analysis, but basically strategy 1 is that the numbers progress upward from 0 to 40 so that the highest number that's appeared at any given point may be followed by lower digits, but never by one more than a single unit larger. That's the most complex. Number 2, there are no numbers. Number 3, the projected square graphic is repeated at regular intervals. Number 4, random non-repeating numbers float around the frame. Number 5 is a consecutive countdown from 40 to 0. Now, some of these are easier to discern, like 2, 3, and 5, than others, 1 and 4. But rather than speculate on the editing strategies they represent, I suggest shifting the focus to how they alter our perception of the loops, which demands a closer look at the film's structure. Okay, so strategy number 1 encompasses the first 8 minutes of the film and accounts for nearly 3 repetitions of the loop. The numerical rules are impossible to grasp or confirm in real time, but the frequent insertions establish the expectation that the numbers somehow organize the images. Meanwhile, it becomes clear that the images are repeating, that we're watching loops. Because the numerical system seems an unsolvable problem, the tendency is to abandon the numbers and focus on the pattern recognition I've already described, the faces, cars, white dress, etc. But the appearance of strategy number 2 throws us for a loop. Strategy number 2 encompasses 2 repetitions of the loop without numbers, the first in color, the second in black and white. But Frampton employs some sleight of hand that does not register in projection, but has subtle effects on our understanding of the structure. First, he inserts the color loop that inaugurates strategy number 2 about 11 seconds before the third loop has completed. Then he shuffles this 11 seconds and their numbers, which, recall, follow the rules of strategy number 1, in between the complete color and black and white loops. In other words, strategy number 2 contains 11 seconds of strategy number 1 inside it. But there is an added complexity, which is that the 11 seconds in question correspond exactly to the frames Frampton shot of the television program Wild Wild West. That is, they account for the first 11 seconds of the loop as he initially filmed it. This same 11 seconds is also missing from the beginning of Remote Control. The film starts with Madigan. So when Wild Wild West appears, we can interpret it as the end of a loop or the beginning of the next. Even without the television listings from the night in question, we can see that Wild Wild West is technically the beginning of the loop in the color sequence, where it appears first in its rightful place. Thus, due to its chromaticity, the color sequence appears an anomaly, but is in fact the text. It's the only iteration of the complete loop as Frampton shot it, which is to say, in the order the programs appeared on TV, in color, in correct orientation, without numbers. This is also probably a good time to mention that the images were flipped in orientation in printing and reframed, which is only revealed when you compare the black and white reels to their color originals. The point of this detailed breakdown is not to suggest that viewers actively seek to determine if Wild Wild West begins or ends the loop. It's quite possible that I am the first of remote control spectators to know that he's looking at Wild Wild West in the first place. Rather, my claim is that Frampton builds into the film the circularity of a film loop as it runs through a projector, a true loop in the sense that it does not stop looping, to convey a subconscious cyclicality, as opposed to the sensation that the film has, let's say, a modular structure, that is, 10 repetitions of the same sequence placed in a row, a kind of reboot model. Now, this would all be very clever but unremarkable, except for the fact that the 5 numerical strategies imply linearity. Although the numbers themselves appear jumbled, the strategies that organize them are deployed ordinally. When Frampton superimposes this linear system onto images that unfold with a circular logic, it produces the uncanny effect that the loops are themselves changing, that the images are permutations. We can never really get the loop straight because our hypotheses about its organization are continuously misconfirmed. This difficult processing is reinforced by subsequently strategies 3, 4, and 5, which I don't have time to talk about here and aren't as noteworthy. It's much more legible to understand what the numbers represent in real time, but unlike strategies 1 and 2, they begin and end in the middle of loops. So by this point, I would suggest that we're playing an unwinnable game. Admittedly, we've traveled far into Frampton's thicket in this presentation, and I'm about out of time. In the longer version of this article, I make some larger claims about the contributions that remote control makes to time-lapse, both as a technique and a concept. But in this talk, I've focused more narrowly on the film's foregrounding of the problem in the problem-solving process by suggesting that remote control presents a torrent of recalcitrant information that cannot be assimilated. The images become increasingly familiar over the course of the film, but frustrate our ability to integrate them into a coherent system. Furthermore, Frampton highlights the ease with which our assumptions about organizational systems cause us to misidentify an ultimately straightforward macro construction. Thus, Frampton uses loop printing in conjunction with the abstracting power of time-lapse to accentuate the viewer's subjectivity. In a foreword to the first volume of his collected writings, Frampton introduces the titular circles of confusion, the relative size of the circle of a point of light that appears to be in focus on the imaging plane, to conclude that even the most exact photographic transcription resolves at last into an orderly collection of imprecisions, bearable or useful only to the extent that its degree of inexactitude is known and forgiven. Transposed to remote control, we might say that subject to repetition, this orderly collection of graphic impressions, which carry the traces of time-lapse exacting scientistic precision, collapse in the viewer's mind into an inexact jumble, bearable only to the extent that the resulting epistemic confusion becomes known and forgiven. I'm very much looking forward to hearing your comments and suggestions and criticisms of this presentation. And I'm also, of course, very much looking forward to seeing all of the other talks at the conference. Thanks very much for your time.